from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, Washington walks away. Homeland Security funding runs out tonight, and lawmakers have already left Washington. The White House and Democrats remain dug in over immigration enforcement. Now the question, how long could this partial shutdown last?
And constant chaos. That's how a new report describes the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Kristi Noem, with controversies ranging from a luxury jet to a pilot fired over a forgotten blanket. As Democrats press for ICE reform, is Noem's tumultuous tenure in Washington nearing its end?
Plus, whipsawed by Washington, the Pentagon posts an updated list of companies it says are tied to the Chinese military, only to pull it minutes later. Wall Street has big questions, and so far, few answers.
And a new world order. Global leaders gather at the Munich Security Conference, where President Trump's wrecking ball diplomacy is taking center stage and facing heavy criticism from key European allies. Germany and France announcing a new nuclear alliance. Bloomberg is on the ground in Munich, covering it all. And we begin there, in Munich, with Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, who joined us today for a wide-ranging conversation. We discussed the possibility of U.S. military action against Iran, the Trump administration's efforts to punish him personally, and what he describes as America's unprecedented diplomacy with the rest of the world.
Well, Kaylee, yeah, I mean, I just got here today. I've had multiple meetings with prime ministers, foreign ministers, defense ministers, many of our allied countries. What I'm hearing from them is, they're really concerned about some of the actions that this White House has taken over the last year, and some of the plans that they've had. I was just meeting with, somebody from Denmark, and the discussion, as you might imagine, goes to Greenland. And, how is it that the United States of America was starting to go down the path of making a decision to use force against one of our NATO allies? This is unprecedented. So I'm here because these are issues discussed here that I really care about. I'm on the Armed Services and the Intelligence Committee, and I think it's important to send the message that what this president and White House might believe is not what all Americans believe. And if you go just like one level down in the government, or maybe two, there's a huge difference of opinion on, the way we should be treating our allies, and that we have common adversaries, and that if we continue to, as we've had since, the 1940s, continue to work together, that benefits all of us.
Senator, you're arriving in Munich as the Pentagon redeploys the USS Jerry Ford Carrier Strike Group once again, heading back toward Iran to join the USS Lincoln. From your perch on the Armed Services Committee and as a naval aviator, do you believe that we will strike Iran when that carrier strike group gets there?
Well, I can't predict what this administration is going to do. I mean, we're at a moment of time with Iran, right now, where they are potentially at a tipping point, and we could see a regime, this oppressive regime that has been in place since the late 1970s. We could see it finally go away, and the Iranians could build a government that they deserve. And that would be a huge win for the entire region. I mean, just think for a second, what happens to the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas without the support of the Iranians, the militias in Iraq. So this is a moment in time. We got, as you say, we got the Ford Battle Group going over there. I also think it's a really hard decision to make, to be, especially if we're going to use kinetic action against the Iranian regime a second time, to try to push this in a direction. It could backfire. And my biggest concern here with this president is I don't see a guy who brings the right people together to get the right information to make informed decisions about anything.
Does this mean that we did not totally obliterate Iran's nuclear program, as the president told us?
That is correct. I mean, there was significant damage done to the Iranian nuclear program. But what the president said was far from true. We did not obliterate it. They have the ability to rebuild it, to start enriching uranium, and we're going to track this rather closely. And, having said that, it was an incredibly successful operation. When I was briefed by the members of the military who are actually flying the planes, the ones that led elements of that strike, they did a remarkable job. It almost could not have gone better. But once those bombs, hit the targets, it's not up to the pilots for what happens after that. And we're going to have to see what the Iranians decide to do here in reconstituting that capability. Are they going to rush at some point to get a nuclear weapon or not? Until we know the final outcome, I think it's hard to say whether this was a good decision or not. But I will give the U.S. military a tremendous amount of credit. It went exceedingly well.
Well, Senator, the man who helped lead the U.S. military, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, of course, has made an effort to demote you and cut your retirement benefits over the illegal orders video you and 5 of your Democratic colleagues participated in. A federal judge just yesterday ruled in your favor, saying that likely violates your First Amendment rights. But the Defense Secretary has said he will appeal this. He says, to quote him, "Sedition is sedition." Captain, how far are you anticipating this will go? And has this become personal enough that you believe that even if courts continue to rule in your favor on this specific issue, they will come after you in other ways?
Well, I said something the president didn't like. I said something what was lawful, that's in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And Donald Trump said I should be hanged, executed, prosecuted. And then he sicked Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, on me to demote me, take away some of my retirement pay. And sure, the grand jury didn't indict me a couple days ago, but I don't put anything past these guys. The president often doubles down on bad ideas. He has a habit of doing this. So I expect him to continue with this effort. But here's the thing. This is much more important than me. This is about the free speech rights of 2 million retired service members and millions of other Americans who have a right to say what they believe and speak out against the government. And it might sound like a couple days ago when they failed to indict me, that was a good thing. But think about this for a second. The president just tried to throw myself and another U.S. senator and members of the House in prison. He's trying to imprison us because he doesn't like what we're saying. So we're getting, close here to, we're certainly in uncharted territory already, but I'm going to continue to fight this because this is about the Constitution, something I served in the United States Navy for 25 years. I went to war for. I fought our enemies for our country and our Constitution, and I'm not going to back down from this president or anybody else.
Well, Senator, you referenced that failed grand jury indictment. One of your colleagues who appeared in that video alongside you, Senator Alyssa Slotkin, has asked the DOJ to confirm whether or not the investigation into the 6 of you has indeed concluded. Have you heard from her as to whether there has been a response to that? Have you yourself heard from the DOJ in that regard?
We hear very little from the DOJ. I think as my office, the last thing we may have heard was that we were not under investigation. And the next thing we find out from the press is they attempted to indict us. This is not how these processes are supposed to work. These folks seem to not know how to do their jobs. And the worst thing about this, though, is the message it sends to the American people. That if you speak out against this government, this president, the attorney general, U.S. attorneys, they're going to come after you. And that is just fundamentally un-American.
Senator Kelly, when you get back to Washington, it looks like the Department of Homeland Security will be closed. It's set to shut down tonight, of course, because of the dispute over DHS and more specifically restrictions around ICE. When you return, we're also going to be talking about the prospect of missed paychecks for folks in the TSA. We're going to be looking at the Coast Guard and FEMA. How long can Democrats hold the line on this?
Well, what we've seen from ICE over the past months in Minneapolis and other cities is an agency that has just run amok and is violating the constitutional rights of thousands and thousands of Americans. We have 2 dead Americans. We have people that have been beaten up. I have a constituent that was just standing on the sidewalk and a federal agent in a vehicle just sprays her in the face with mace. I mean, what is going on? I mean, this agency needs to be overhauled. People need to be fired. Why are they in uniforms that tactical operators in Fallujah wear? I mean, why don't they wear name tags? They seem to not follow any reasonable use of force criteria. The agency needs to be fixed in a dramatic way. And until that happens, I mean, I am not in favor of funding them beyond what the president gave them and Republicans in the House and Senate gave them in his big piece of legislation, which was $75 billion to be spent over 3 years. You know, they have resources. They do not need more resources that will go towards violating the rights of the American people.
But of course, as we've established, the TSA, FEMA, Coast Guard get penalized by this action as well. Senator, are there talks underway in Munich about crafting a deal? Because we know that negotiations have been underway in the background. What are you hearing?
You know, hey, the Republicans know what they need to do here. You know, we sent a reasonable proposal to the White House. They sent an unreasonable and unserious response. You know, and I think at this point, many of them realize that this situation has gotten out of control and it has to be fixed. So if they would sit down with us and seriously consider what we're asking them to do with this agency, I think we could rather quickly get to a deal.
Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona speaking with us earlier today from the Munich Security Conference. 12:01 a.m. DHS shuts down. And joining us now with her reaction to our conversation and a bit of breaking news here is Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who joins us here in our Washington bureau, the leader of our Capitol Influence team. Megan, obviously Republicans and Democrats are having a bit of a trust issue these days, and this partial shutdown is becoming what feels like a routine to a lot of people. The President of the United States just got on Truth Social to start turning the knife on voter ID. This is something that he's, of course, been talking about a lot lately with the Save America Act. He says we cannot let the Democrats get away with no voter ID any longer. These are horrible, disingenuous cheaters. And as I go all the way down here, if we can't get it through Congress, there are legal reasons why this scam is not permitted. I will be presenting them shortly. And he says he will do this with or without Congress in time for the midterm elections. How?
So first, we should start by saying there is no evidence of massive voter fraud. And that is certainly his basis, what he is saying to push this forward in Congress. The House passed a bill just a few days ago before leaving town to a second voter ID bill, a follow-on to something that they did just a few months ago. This legislation, though, is pretty much dead on arrival in the Senate, where you need 60 votes to get anything done. So we're not even expecting the Senate to even take it up. I will say if the president does pursue an executive order on this, we're likely to face numerous court challenges that could delay this beyond the midterms.
Well, so when we consider whether or not the votes are there for something like this, certainly the votes were not there last night, Megan, to continue funding the Department of Homeland Security. Despite the efforts of the Republican majority, lawmakers left town yesterday with no deal in sight. Come midnight, the Department of Homeland Security is going to run out of money. The question is, for how long could this partial shutdown last, knowing we're coming off of a record shutdown over a separate fight over health care, and Democrats don't seem willing to back down on this one either.
Yeah, this is going to be a standoff. First of all, Congress is out of town next week for a recess. Many of them are in Munich, like Senator Kelly. So they're not even going to be back for another 10 days or so. This has the potential to drag on for quite some time because they are at loggerheads over what to do over ICE. In terms of, whether federal agents are masked, whether they are required to wear identification, et cetera, et cetera. There is no area of agreement. Both sides are saying that they're shooting each other different offers, and those offers are essentially dead on arrival. Democrats want something in law. They have said they will not settle for something along the lines of an executive order, and they've been quite firm on that. Since this is just one agency, this could go on for quite some time. I should say CBP and Border Patrol, the two agencies under DHS that are at the center of this disagreement between the two parties, will continue to be funded and likely will get pay through Trump's tax bill that was enacted earlier last year now. But other parts of DHS, such as the TSA, the people that we all encounter at the airports, will not get their paychecks should this go on much longer.
You know, just in our remaining moment, Kaylee and I spoke with Debbie Wasserman Schultz this morning, who's on appropriations. Her the Democratic leader on that committee, the ranking member, Rosa DeLauro, put a bill up this week that would carve out ICE, allow TSA, FEMA, Coast Guard to be funded, and then just zero in on this issue. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is not in favor of this any more than Republicans appear to be. And as Kaylee mentioned at the time, this is all about leverage, right?
It is. Leverage, this is Democrats' biggest point of leverage. And Rosa DeLauro, of course, being the senior Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, the panel that controls spending, they all hate continuing resolutions because it takes a lot of their power away, right? They write these long bills with all of these add-ons and their favorite projects, and the CR essentially undoes all of that, or at least delays it. So that tension is something that is real, that is felt in both parties. It doesn't surprise me that that she is pushing back on that. But I think writ large, Democrats would like to have some kind of they want to have something tangible to show for this effort. They feel like they won the 43-day shutdown in the fall, which was a fight over health care costs, even though they didn't get any concessions from Republicans. This time they want to enact concessions, and we are getting closer and closer to the midterms, and it is becoming more and more important to them to win this fight.
Closer to the midterms and closer to this partial shutdown. We've got less than 7 hours to go. Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you so much. Coming up, the Pentagon adds Alibaba to a list of companies that aid the Chinese military, then quickly withdraws it. We will discuss the details and what this could mean for President Trump's upcoming meeting with China's Xi Jinping next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Numbers, very low inflation. We brought costs way down, and the numbers were surprising, except to me, they weren't surprising. So the inflation numbers just announced, as you know, are way down, and we have it back in track. We had the worst inflation in the history of our country, and now we have very modest inflation, which is what you want to have.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where President Trump there spoke to this morning's inflation data. The CPI for January rising in its smallest gain since July, boosting expectations for more Fed rate cuts. The news was well received on Wall Street, and we learn more about it in Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, live from New York. Hey, Nora.
Well, Joe, taking a look at how the action played out today in the trade, we did see the NASDAQ higher by about 0.2%. The S&P 500 inching up just above flat. So we were seeing it higher by about 0.1%. And also just kind of looking at small caps, we did see a bit of action when we look at the Russell. I mean, of course, we did see that up more than 1% on the day, but it's Friday, so we have to take a look at the weekly scope. This was a tough week for a lot of those tech names. I mean, we saw the NASDAQ 100 hitting its lowest level since November, and the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average seeing their worst week since November. So while people were really digesting that cooler than expected CPI data, they're also really thinking about what we should be thinking in terms of the tech names here. And taking a look at Treasury yields, we did see them falling. We saw the 2-year sitting at about 3.4%. That's the lowest since 2022. But we did see the 5-year, the 10-year, and the 30 also slipping. So you are really seeing traders really pricing in higher chances that the Fed will slash rates more than twice this year. But taking a look at some of the precious metals, I've got my eyes on gold and silver because this is something that we continue to keep an eye on. Gold up more than 2% today, topping that $5,000 level that we've really been seeing as a key metric as of late. Silver at about $77 per ounce. And the USD, looking at the US dollar, down just about 0.1%, but Bitcoin really hanging around that $68,000 level. But back to the tech space, we've really been keeping our eyes on those mega cap Mag 7 names. I mean, we've really been seeing a lot of people concerned about software stocks. So you did see an index of Mag 7 stocks down about 3% this week, and that is the lowest since October. One of the names I want to call out in particular is Amazon. This was the longest losing streak that we've seen for the company in almost 20 years, and that's really stemming from the earnings that we saw, not necessarily the metrics that they provided, but the forward outlook. They were talking about $200 billion being spent just on CapEx, and that is certainly rattling investors.
Well, and U.S. technology is one thing, Nora, but we saw some interesting action today in the ADRs of Chinese tech stocks as well. Walk us through it.
Yeah, so we did see that the Pentagon added Alibaba, Baidu, BYD, and TP-Link Technologies to a list of companies that aid the Chinese military before withdrawing it just a few minutes later without explanation. But you did see some action in the trade, especially as we saw investors really fleeing from Baidu ADRs. And then also we did see U.S. listed shares of Alibaba down as much as 1.9%. So you did see that both Alibaba and Baidu rejected the idea of any sort of inclusion. They said that they will take legal action against attempts to misrepresent them. Kaylee.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. And joining us now for a deeper dive on that story, the Pentagon's decision or perhaps indecision around whether these companies are contributing to the Chinese military. For more on that, Bloomberg's Michael Shepard is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Mike, what should we make of this idea that you put out a list, you abruptly withdraw it, the companies deny that they have anything to do with the Chinese military, so where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves us with a lot of questions that remain unanswered by the Pentagon. We went to the Defense Department to ask what happened, why is this list being pulled, this notice being pulled, and they said they had nothing to announce at this time. Now, this is a consequential listing that comes out every year. It's been published every year since 2021. It now includes as many as 130 Chinese companies ranging from airlines to construction firms to makers of computer equipment. And the listing here, while it doesn't carry any immediate legal repercussions, it is a warning to investors. And we saw how Wall Street reacted in trading of those ADRs that Nora was just talking about in New York. And it is also perhaps a signal of how the U.S. government may move in the future when it comes to restricting those companies through measures taken by other non-Pentagon agencies, and whether there might be some sort of trade sanction or other measure taken. Now, we still don't know what will come and when. The Pentagon later, in a note that was sent to the operators of the Federal Register website where these notices are posted, said that it wanted the notice pulled and yet may republish it again on Tuesday. So we will be waiting to see what happens.
All this
then.
is happening ahead of a summit here between Presidents Trump and Xi in April. So the timing is important here. In our remaining moment, Mike, was this a fat finger or a flex?
It's unclear. And there is some thought that this could be a flex in a way of sending a message to China that the U.S. will remain firm in these questions of national security and perhaps separating trade policy from those key national security questions. And we had gotten a signal that this might be coming at the end of last year through some reporting, but China had reacted badly at that time, saying the U.S. should reconsider this kind of a decision. So we'll want to see what happens from Beijing in the coming days, Joe.
Great reporting, Mike. We do have more to learn. Certainly didn't play well for those ADRs. We thank you, as always, Mike Shepard. Coming up, Bloomberg on the ground at the Munich Security Conference. We're going to head back and discuss what is on the agenda, how world leaders are anticipating. Marco Rubio on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. Republican Senator Thom Tillis is not changing his tune on confirming a new Fed chair, saying that he will block the Senate Banking Committee from voting on the nomination until the investigation into current chair Jay Powell is settled. He spoke with Bloomberg TV and radio from the Munich Security Conference earlier today.
Well, we can have a hearing all we want, but until the investigation is done, I still believe that the initial inquiry and the investigation was a flex to try and get the current chair to step aside. Chair Powell has a term as chair that expires in May. He also has a term that could extend for 2 more years. I have no intention allowing any Fed board nominee to move forward out of committee and to be confirmed until this matter is settled. Look, this is foundational to Fed independence, and I, for one, am going to stand on the side of certainty, and Fed independence is what delivers certainty in our markets.
So, Senator, it's intriguing because we heard from the Treasury Secretary earlier on this morning, speaking to the American press, and he said the following, that I spoke with Republican senators early this week, and I think we have agreement to go ahead with the Warsh hearing. Do you have an understanding of where he's getting that impression from?
Well, you know, I've said that if they shouldn't confuse or conflate 2 issues. The suggestion that we should have an oversight hearing to see how well this building project with the Fed has gone is fine with me. In fact, I think we should have that kind of oversight for the East Wing construction, the upfit of the Air Force One that's kind of a mini Air Force One because it can't fly out of U.S. borders. All of that is just good governance oversight. None of that has anything to do with an investigation that I believe was dead on arrival. We are talking about 2 minutes of testimony that 7 members of the Banking Committee, Republican members, including the chair, have all said did not constitute a crime. We've got a prosecutor who's not listening to the eyewitnesses and continuing. That's not productive, and I'm not going to allow it. Maybe they can convince a Democrat to vote with them, but as long as I'm the deciding vote, we can have Mr. Warsh, who I would love to be the next Fed chair, but I'm not going to confirm the next Fed chair until I can be absolutely certain that these sorts of flexes do not always have members of the Federal Reserve Board or the chair looking over their shoulder wondering when they get the call from some U.S. attorney with a dream.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina online or on the terminal. And of course, Senator Tillis is just one of many lawmakers who have made tracks to the Munich Security Conference, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio is set to give a closely watched speech tomorrow, with the global dignitaries gathered there looking for signals on the trajectory of U.S. diplomacy. Bloomberg's Olivier Crook has been covering the action on the ground in Munich and filed this report from the field earlier today.
It was in this very hotel that 12 months ago, the MAGA foreign policy made its global debut in the form of a speech given by the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, before a rather shocked European audience, in which he told them that Russia was not the biggest threat to their way of life, nor China, but the threat from within, their own liberal, democratic, and so-called woke governments. In those next 12 months that ensued, we've seen a seismic shift across Europe in terms of its defense policy. Now all NATO members have committed to spend 3.5% of their GDP on defense spending. The war in Ukraine rages on as the Trump administration reaches out to Vladimir Putin, who paid a visit to Donald Trump on U.S. soil. And of course, we have this question here ever since the Greenland incident of whether or not the Europeans can go it alone and can defend their own continent without the help of the United States. And that has really been the big focus here at the Munich Security Conference. We've also heard from a number of other U.S. officials, including Democratic senators, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who try to offer a different view of foreign policy to some of the Europeans to try to reassure them in the room. But everybody here will be waiting with bated breath for the words of Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, slated to speak tomorrow. Will he be more diplomatic than J.D. Vance 12 months ago?
Bloomberg's Olivier Crook reporting from the Munich Security Conference. We thank you so much. Shortly before the president boarded Air Force One, just in the last hour, he spoke to the press, commenting on the ongoing situation with Iran, telling reporters additional aircraft carriers, plural, will head to the region. Take a listen.
Give us the deal that they should have given us the first time. If they give us the right deal, we won't do that. But, you know, historically, they haven't done that. I will say they want to talk, but so far they do a lot of talking and no action.
We should note that only a single aircraft carrier strike group is now being redeployed. That's the USS Jerry Ford Carrier Strike Group, currently steaming its way from the Caribbean toward Iran to join the USS Lincoln. And with us now for insights into all of this unfolding at the Munich Security Conference and in Iran is Michael Allen, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies, former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in the national security sector. I remember the last time you sat in that chair and we asked you if we were about to strike Iran. I believe your answer was yes, and of course we did. How about now?
Well, I think we're going to do it again.
Yeah.
I think just considering the politics of it all, I think President Trump has already said that he is painted into a corner, more or less, by saying we're locked and loaded and you should come out onto the streets. And if we don't do it, it sort of it raises the strategic word of the United States. So I think he has to do it. He wants to be strength. That's his brand, and I think that's the way he's going to go.
Well, so what does he do differently from the strike we saw last June, where we targeted the nuclear facilities? And he, of course, argues we completely eliminated Iran's capacity to produce a nuclear weapon. Wouldn't a second strike suggest that that was not, in fact, true?
Well, I do think that they've probably found additional targets on the militarization side of the nuclear weapons program. I think he's going to hit, like Israel wants to do, ballistic missile sites, because they've been able to reconstitute those at a greater rate than anyone anticipated.
So you think Netanyahu convinced him of that this week? Or
I do, and I think our intel is probably saying as much. But I do think that he still has to connect it somehow back to the protesters. So maybe I still believe he's going to hit like the IRGC and the Besiege, who are the thugs on the back of motorcycles who were beating people with baseball bats. I still think he has to connect it back to that somehow. So I would look for some, let's call them instruments of regime repression, to take a shot.
So this is less about going after large military targets and more about going after individuals, the way Israel has perfected. Is that your thought?
Well, I think the Israelis, I do believe that they will participate in this, and I think they're really into decapitation strikes.
Okay.
And so maybe we'll join as well if you think about the top level of the regime.
Yep.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I think generally, though, and President Trump has shifted over to ballistic missiles because he wants something that's going to be measurable. Mm-hmm. If he just hits sites related to the protests and people say, well, you didn't achieve regime change, it might be seen as a failure. So it feels like he's broadening the scope of what's possible so that he can claim success later.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we consider broadening the scope of that, perhaps he does seem to also be narrowing his focus, at least when we think of the different theaters in the world, to areas like the Middle East, arguably the Caribbean as well, with Venezuela, and maybe leaving Europe in question as to where exactly the U.S. stands on issues pertaining to our European allies. And that's happening as the Munich Security Conference is underway right now. Bloomberg actually was able to speak with Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin on the sidelines of that conference about what message she and other Democrats are bringing compared to the ones that the Trump administration may be sending.
A lot of us who are here, certainly from the Senate and the House, to send the message that not everyone agrees with the approach that this president is taking, right? That my president is taking, which is kick your allies in the teeth and cozy up to your adversaries. It's the opposite of what many of us were taught and how we lived.
My question, Michael, is how you think that message is received when the Democrats are the minority party right now. There's at least 3 more years until something is going to change in that regard.
Yeah, I think it gives the Europeans a little hope, but I still think they're fundamentally considering that the United States may be going a different direction. I don't think we'll ever be back to the place that we were where we completely subsidized European security. By the way, I was okay with it because it allowed us to call the shots. But such as things are these days, fiscally and given the rise of China, I do think we have to give way a little bit to the Europeans leading the show. I think it was probably okay for the president early in his term to say to Europe, you've got to get to 5%. We can't always be there. But I would quit beating them up badly about Greenland and civilizational suicide and the other things I keep hearing about.
I don't mean to be too cute here in the age of Trump, but what happened to politics ending at the water's edge? You've got a codel of Democratic senators going overseas to talk about the United States president essentially as a pariah with the message, just hang on 3 more years?
It's just another one of the norms and traditions of American politics that has gone by the wayside.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Trump, of course, has just punctuated the age. We're in the age of populism with polarization, and I think this is just par for the course of where we've been for some time.
Wow.
Well, and of course, when we consider the message from the Trump administration, it was a message delivered in striking fashion by Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference last year.
Right.
It's the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's going to be speaking this time around. Do you expect his message to be materially different? What do you think we'll see from Rubio?
So I do. I don't think you'll see Rubio primarily focus on free speech in Europe. I think he will talk more about NATO. I think he'll talk more about some of the things that do bind us together. I think he'll talk a lot about Ukraine as well. I don't think he'll necessarily deviate so much from what the president's words are, but I think he's going to say the president wants to reach peace in Ukraine. We do have sanctions on the Russians, even though the Europeans will say we should do more, and we should. They'll say it's great that the Europeans are stepping up with the defense industrial base rehabilitation and, of course, the arms that they're already shipping. But the United States has more to do, and to the degree that Rubio, even if it's behind doors, can assure people that the president's not completely turning his back on Ukraine, I think that'll be reassuring for the Europeans.
So is the Munich Security Conference now the staging ground for presidential candidates?
I think so. I mean, with
this
AOC
is the 2028 lineup there now.
Oh, I think everybody knows this is the premier foreign policy event of the year. And so I think everybody is over there, and they want to see different people. They want to try to get some international affairs experience, and this is the spot to do it. And I've been to this conference a half dozen times. The Europeans love to see the Americans come, and we're there in force.
Right.
All right, Michael Allen, thank you so much for being with us here in our Washington, D.C. studio, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies. Still ahead, Kristi Noem heads to Phoenix to push for the passage of election security legislation. We'll bring you what she said. Plus, Virginia Democrats get a redistricting win from the state Supreme Court that could impact the outcome of this year's midterms. More when our political panel joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Our political panel is just ahead, but first, here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The Virginia Supreme Court just allowed a Democrat-led redistricting vote to move forward, with early voting starting on March 6th. The court is still weighing the case brought to block a redrawing of the state's congressional maps mid-decade, but its decision today gives a temporary win for Virginia Democrats pushing for a map that could favor their party and net them as many as 4 additional House seats come November.
We're learning more about the extent to which ICE is planning to use warehouses around the country for detention centers. The Trump administration is now moving ahead with a more than $38 billion plan to remake the immigration detention system in a sweeping expansion that officials say will streamline operations and speed deportations. The Detention Re-Engineering Initiative calls for acquiring and renovating 8 large-scale detention centers, adding 16 processing sites, and taking control of 10 existing turnkey facilities where ICE already operates. The largest facilities will have the capacity to hold as many as 10,000 people.
And Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem journeyed to Arizona today, holding a press conference on, quote, election security less than 9 months before the midterms. Noem pitching the SAVE Act legislation, which would require proof of citizenship and photo ID to cast a vote, and had this message for critics of the bill.
Each of the arguments that have been laid out to criticize this bill are baseless speculation from the radical left because they want illegal aliens to vote in our elections. They want to disenfranchise American citizens by telling them that their votes don't matter. There's only one reason that anyone would oppose this bill, and that's because they would want to cheat. They want illegal people and aliens in this country to be able to vote for them and to rob the United States citizens of their vote.
Arizona Secretary of State Anton Fuentes said in January that he fears attempts of election interference following the president's call to federalize the election in several states.
Joining us now with their reaction to these stories and more this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, our Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, Democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. I'm going to add another log on the fire here when it comes to the Kristi Noem story. A big splash in the Wall Street Journal, Rick and Jeannie, that talks about chaos inside the agency. Noem and Corey Lewandowski, her assistant, frequently berate senior-level staff, it says, give polygraph tests to employees they don't trust, and have fired employees. In one incident, Lewandowski fired a Coast Guard pilot after Noem's blanket was left behind on a plane, only to be unfired so they could get a ride home. We asked Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida about these revelations and her concerns about the way ICE is comporting itself and the future for Kristi Noem. Here's what she said.
Kristi Noem is a hot, horrific mess who, if she doesn't get fired or step down herself, needs to be impeached. She has essentially assembled one of the largest agencies in our federal government in service of her own self-promotion and attention is an outrage. And she is singularly incompetent.
Rick Davis, a hot and horrible mess. Is Kristi Noem in danger of losing her job?
Yeah, the Republican version of that is a dumpster fire.
Okay.
But I think you get to the right place.
Yeah.
I don't know if she's in danger of losing her job. There's been a lot of mischief in the administration that goes unchecked. You pick the agency, and we can talk about that all day long. But at the end of the day, I think as long as President Trump continues to have confidence in her and what she's trying to accomplish, which is pretty controversial on its own with the immigration surge, then she's going to stick around, right? Because as long as it doesn't look like it's hurting him, I don't think he cares what kind of torture the cabinet secretaries go through. And right now, I mean, she's, as you pointed out, in Arizona trying to change the subject. Yeah. But I think this Wall Street Journal piece, if accurate, is going to dog her until she ultimately leaves the administration.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I would love to talk more about the blanket in question in this piece, Jeannie. But given what Rick was just talking about, what she went to Arizona to try to talk about, she was talking about election integrity and voter ID and pushing for legislation in Congress. But President Trump this afternoon on True Social is suggesting that he's going to try to enforce voter ID whether or not Congress passes legislation, suggesting he'll do this via executive order, that this will be done by the midterms with or without Congress. Jeannie, that is not how things are supposed to work in this democracy.
Absolutely not. Kristi Noem took her chaos and her blanket and she went out to Arizona today, and she is following the orders of the president, which is why she is there. He knows how much chaos she has sown in the Department of Homeland Security, and she's going to try to do the same thing as it pertains to the midterm election. And there is one reason and one reason alone this is happening, and that is because Donald Trump is seeing the same polls we are. The polls for Trump and the Republicans 9 months out of this election are devastating. His poll support has plummeted on everything: overall approval on the economy, approval on immigration, approval on foreign policy. You go down the list. He knows, like we all know, that you can't win if things are that way. So what's he going to try to do? He's going to try to sow chaos in this election. He's out, as you mentioned, on Truth Social this afternoon, talking about the fact that we need this because we have people who shouldn't be voting. Well, Mr. President, you closed the border. So if those people who are voting, they were here in 2024 and they elected you, none of it makes an ounce of sense, except he knows he's going to lose. And there's one thing that he doesn't like is he or his party that he's leading losing. And he's going to try to make Americans believe that they can't trust the polls in November.
Rick, he writes in this post, if we can't get it through Congress, there are legal reasons why this scam is not permitted. I will be presenting them shortly. What about affordability? Are we going to relitigate the election for the rest of the midterm cycle?
Yeah, it looks like the issue that seems to be attracting more his attention rather than the economy and affordability. And by the way, some decent economic news today for the administration. Right. But do you hear him talking about it? Not at all. Look, all this stuff, all these executive orders that he's doing are being challenged in court. He did an election executive order in March of last year, making it very difficult for military overseas and overseas voters to vote. That just got struck down in the courts. OK, so that's not going to happen. And my suspicion is any effort to federalize at the state level is going to have a pushback from the states. There's not a Republican or a Democratic governor who thinks nationalizing their elections is a good idea. So unless he puts marshals in every single polling place in America, I don't know how he implements an executive order that will be likely struck down by the federal court. Mm-hmm.
Well, and we should note as well that some 3/4 of U.S. states already have some form of voter ID law in effect too. So that is worth noting. And we should point out as well, and if you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you can see this in real time. President Trump, along with the First Lady, Melania Trump, has just landed in Palm Beach after earlier traveling to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Of course, if the president makes any further remarks on this last leg of his journey to Mar-a-Lago for the weekend, we will bring them to you. Jeannie, it's worth noting that President Trump has left Washington, spending the weekend in Florida, just as every elected representative essentially has left Washington as of yesterday, despite the fact that come midnight, the Department of Homeland Security is going to run out of funding. We're going to see a partial shutdown unless something drastic changes in the last 6 hours. Optically, when everyone leaves D.C. knowing that that's going to happen, where's the blowback going to come? For Republicans or Democrats?
Yeah, everybody has left, Kaylee, except you, Joe, and Rick. You're there. So if you're going to save the government and keep us open, it's going to be you three. No, this thing is definitely shutting down, bar an act of God, and I don't see that coming. I think all sides believe that their base is supporting what they're doing. And for Democrats, the polls show that there's some basis for that. I think, as I look back and, we are now so used to these government shutdowns in a way we weren't 10 or 20 years ago. The difference in my mind is that the voters don't want their elected representatives and senators to work across the aisle. They want them to send a message. So if you talk to Democrats, what they're hearing from their constituents is do not make a deal. Keep fighting. This thing, what happened in Minneapolis, has gone too far. You just gave ICE, 3 or 4 times what they normally have. You want to pay TSA workers, pull the money out of there. I mean, this is what they're hearing. And so I don't see a universe in which, in the short term, they're able to negotiate a deal. And particularly since nobody's going to get a deal without giving up something, and no one seems prepared to do that at this point.
You've been pretty optimistic about the potential for a breakthrough, Rick, and we're told that negotiations are continuing even with everybody out of town. Could we be surprised in a week or so by a deal?
Yeah, I mean, when you hear from Katie Britt, the lead negotiator in the Senate, and the majority leader in the Senate, Senator Thom, you would think that we were on the precipice of a deal. And I don't think they would stick their necks out like that if there weren't productive conversations going on below what we're hearing, from rank and file members who aren't necessarily involved in that. I mean, as Jeannie points out, people are having too much fun with their talking points, berating each other over the fact that, somebody's making us less safe by not having this agency fully funded. All that will wind itself out. But look, this has got some lead time. I mean, it's going to be weeks before anybody misses a paycheck or that government services aren't going to be performed. So I think that people have just gotten lazy in the sense that, no one's going to be harmed if we just give this a little bit more time to bake a deal. Mm-hmm.
But quickly, Rick, the State of the Union is on February 24th. Do you think President Trump would want to deliver that, knowing the Department of Homeland Security is currently closed?
Well, I think he's going to want to have a deal by then. And even if it's just an announced deal, they'll continue to work over the holidays. Look, everyone's running around. Jeannie's right. Nobody's left in the city but us.
Yeah. And we're about to change that because the show's over and we can all start our weekend. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzino, thank you both so much for joining us. And if you'd like some weekend reading, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Who's going to be left in D.C. after we leave? Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Kaylee, great to have you back this week. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.